Pleasure to be here, and I greet you in the names of those women activists who've given their lives so that we can have a free South Africa and I can be traveling around. So I'm very happy, and thank you to the Peace Institute who facilitated that I could be here and maybe to share some of my story, some of my analysis, and maybe we can have an exchange, okay? Yeah? So without further ado, I'm going to introduce myself because the topic is about migration, development and gender implications in Africa, and I thought, well, I'm just an example of migration. As you can see, I'm not classical black African because in my part of the world the First Nations are not that very dark. They're the Khoi and the San. But on the other side, I also have slave roots from India. That was forced migration. So I've got Indian, Mozambique, Khoisan, Scottish, and at the moment I've got family in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, USA, UK, Belgium, Germany. And at some stage of my life, we've had family in Dubai, Angola, Libya, and I'm in Rwanda now. So as you can see, I think I exemplify what is migration, forced and not forced. Apart from the development part, okay, and also I come from South Africa, which is the Rainbow Nation. I know that very often people are a little bit taken aback because I'm not black African, but we're this very wonderful mixed breeding, potpourri, you know. So that's moi, okay. Currently, South Africa is still a nation of migrants. We have 11 official languages. If I speak too fast, will you just sort of slow down, yeah? 11 official languages, and we have 8 others which we are promoting, like Gujarati, French, German, Greek, and with a population of 50 million. Also, in about the 15th century, black Africans from Central Africa came to Southern Africa. So as I said to you before, the First Nations in South Africa are not very dark. If any of you have ever seen a picture of Nelson Mandela, that's how my ancestors look, sort of, you know, cinnamon brown, okay, and sort of slightly sort of mongoloid eyes, okay. And South Africa has always been a receptacle of labor from other parts of Africa because we've had, of course, a colonial government, but we also had gold, diamond, silver, so we've always had a pool of workers from other parts of Africa, and we still have today. Okay, yeah, so we have lots of job over here. We also have lots of technical expertise from other parts of the world. And we have a brain drain from other African countries to South Africa and also from other Asian countries. But on the other hand, we also have a lot of South Africans, especially white South Africans, who are leaving South Africa, who don't like the fact that we have a black government, a black majority government. And if you go to the South Island of New Zealand, the majority of doctors and lawyers will be South Africans. Certain parts of Canada, like Saskatchewan, they even have their own listserv and their own email, whatever you call it, you know. So yes, there's South Africans all over. I think one of the sad things that I need to also share about our new South Africa is that even though we're new South Africa, we haven't always left the discrimination and negative feelings in the past. So we have this massive Africans coming from other parts of Africa, but we also have, you know, the Germans and the French and the Dutch, etc., coming there. And there's an increase, and I won't use the word xenophobia, I use the word Afrophobia. Because there's a lot of tension against other Africans. So, and it's also to do with poor people around resources and the patriarchal argument. They take in our women, our land and our jobs. And I mean, that's really not true because the Africans that have come from other parts of the world, of Africa, really, like the Somalians, have started all these little kiosks on the corners. We've never had that before. So we're getting a nice sort of cosmopolitan African feeling. You almost feel more African in South Africa now, you know. Because in fact, some of my European friends, when they used to come to, especially Cape Town, I'm from the very, very south, they say, oh, they feel they're in the Mediterranean, you know, and it's very sort of pale, you know, and male. So anyway, now we're getting a little bit more African. So I'm also going to make short references to my own country, apart from a general, of course you can't really generalize Africa, as you know, you can't generalize Europe, you know, or any place for that. And I'll speak about issues of gender equality, reconciliation. I know you're doing conflict management. One of the negatives, I think, was that our Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a temporary one. And how we use Memorial Days, as opposed to Rwanda, which has in their constitution permanent institutions like the National Commission on Unity and Reconciliation. They have the National Commission Fighting Genocide, which are permanent structures. In other words, it's transitional justice is an ongoing engagement. And I do think very negatively and very disappointingly that in some parts of South Africa, people think, oh, you know, everything's solved. Whereas, you know, the problems are just, it's easier to break down a country than to build up a new country. And I think maybe some of you also have that experience. New countries, Rwanda, even Slovenia. Okay, and then we'll have some questions. Yeah. Okay, as I've just actually analyzed what I was going to do there, and then I have some questions like, can gender equality within the development paradigm be achieved given the complexities of histories, culture, religions within Africa? It's a question. Another question I'm going to ask is the whole issue of all these wonderful international instruments which just about every country, African country, has ratified. And I find that there's a big schism between what they've signed and what's happening in the country. I guess that's very good. So again, there's no way we can, again, generalize about Africa. So I come from the right at the bottom there, Cape Town, the most southerly point of Africa. And as we all know, there are such different cultures. I mean, the north of Africa is going through the Arab Spring and that transformation, religious-wise, in West Africa, and of course East Africa, where I'm now living, with different dynamics. So yeah, you cannot generalize. So it's just a skim. And then I saw this picture and I thought, oh, you know, I think I want to use that picture. You don't have to look at my face all the time. But I also see the synergy between this aeroplane and the smoke and this beautiful bird. And I thought, gosh, now if we had all these wonderful African international instruments and there was some synergy what's happening in our country, that would be wonderful. We have all these development policies. And, you know, so you have the rhetoric on the one hand, and you have the reality. And sometimes they are just worlds and poles apart. Okay, so yes, development and migration is sometimes seen as a threat or potential. And South Africa, it's been both positive and negative. I just sort of added that issue there that about the wealth, that the Queen of England has our diamond in her crown, the biggest diamond in the world. And yeah, and there's some wonderful things also in Rwanda that I want to share with you around Akachiro and the many challenges, of course. Okay, so I'm going to just really flip through some of the issues around development. As I say, there's sometimes not a synchronization, a coming together of the theories and the reality. We have very impressive constitutions. I think in some of your studies you are acquainted with some of these very impressive constitutions. And then I think ultimately the aim of development is to make citizens of us all. And what does that mean? And is that the case? Can we say that marginalized groups, I'm not quite sure if you use the term LGBTI, yeah, right? Are they seen as citizens? Women in the rural area, you know, people with disabilities. I'm always amazed at Vesti, the number of steps in Rwanda. I think the architects pride themselves on all these steps. I mean, they are not even functional. You know, the one hotel, the prof, you go up and you go down, you go up and down. What does it mean for people in wheelchairs, you know? So, yes, we have wonderful policies. Okay, so I didn't actually check what time I started. So I'm not quite sure, how much I must just skim through, okay? We know that developments around economic transformation, and we know that it started very early, and we have all these development programs and all these signatures and all sorts of pacts. And has there actually been any change? Have the lives of, I always like to say, the black rural girl child actually changed with all these wonderful policies? And I think that policies, if they can affect positively the lives of the rural girl child, then maybe it actually has an impact. But if not, I question it. Yes, it may include migration, immigration, it may include gender equality, but again, I ask the issue, is it just a matter of, adding women and stirring? It can include radical reflection, it can include transformation. But as an African, I want to really emphasize that I do not do any analysis of my situation or any situation in Africa or in our communities without looking at what I call culture and religion. I think those are, for me, the two very, very big stumbling blocks. And I also think that some of our leaders and our traditional leaders actually use culture to promote their own agenda, to promote and reinforce patriarchy. We all know that culture is not static, and how's it used? And one of the things that I've actually discovered in all my work at looking at culture and which aspects have been maintained and which have not been maintained is those aspects that are detrimental to women have been maintained. And I challenge you, we can go to any country in Africa. Issues around women and what is detrimental to them, those traditional customs have been maintained. Those are not, and those are detrimental to men, are relegated to the past. So then culture can change, yeah? But in terms of women, no. Okay, again, there are lots of theories. I also will make a slight reference between development aid and the relationship in Africa and Europe. We are in here. And even though I'm going to focus on Africa, I think that some of the issues are relevant for other parts of the world as well. Okay? And there's my picture again that I thought, this is the theme of what I want to say. I want to say this is the theme, that there's the wonderful international instruments, there are those wonderful constitutions, and is there synchronicity? Yeah, that's my theme. So if you remember anything what I say, remember this picture. Okay, and then, I don't know if you've heard of a wonderful feminist from Ghana, Ama Atu Edu. Any of you heard of her? She's actually, at one stage she was the Minister of Education, but she's also a wonderful writer, Ama Atu Edu, and she started a women's writing group in Accra. And she said, I challenge the Western media, because whenever there are pictures and images of Africa, it's always with this woman and this child with flies floating around her head, and we just want to actually break that media. So I saw this wonderful picture of flamingos in Kenya. I thought, I'm just going to put it in there, just say, this is Africa, this is the wonderful, diverse, different, eclectic, dynamic continent of ours, not so Western. It's a wonderful place, but it has its problems, but as feminists we must see how we can change some of these things, okay? So yes, there are various cultural, economic and political aspects that impact on development and underdevelopment, and one has to bear in mind the diversity and the complexity of Africa as a continent, and also the interactions, the political interactions, the economic, the social actors involved in development, and who are developing whom, I sometimes ask. Yeah? And sometimes we have to develop the developers when they come with their stereotypical, northern-centric perspectives of Africa, so we must educate them. The problems of development are diverse, there are different theories, we have the neoliberalism, we have critics, we have good governance. Now, that's a bit of a question that I think I'm going to emphasize a little bit, the issue of good governance. What do we mean by good governance? We have the issue around poverty, we have human rights and development, and I sometimes question can we use the human rights approach as the panacea? Can human rights approach solve everything? Sustainable development, development states, and also what's very important, the roles of civil society in development, NGOs, and then of course, I think you may realize in this talk that I have an issue around religion, the faith-based organizations, and what is happening. And I live in a suburb in Rwanda, a very colorful suburb called Kimironko, which is very near the market, and there are all these people. But I must emphasize to you that I've got 8 churches within a minute walk of my house. So you can imagine how I'm bombarded with all these different degrees of song and drumming and scream sometimes. But there's a wonderful new law that actually curtails disturbance of peace. But I don't think it's been, you know, we must actually see how we can implement that law. Okay, so in terms of migration, it will obviously continue to shape the continent's social structure, the economy and development objectives. Africa, of course, has a history of pull and push, those of you who are in migration, pulling and pushing. Although I think sometimes in terms of Africa, there are more pushing factors pushing away from Africa. We've got the whole issue of conflict. And in terms of number, of the 150 million migrants in the world, more than 50 million are estimated to be Africans. Furthermore, about 50% of the internally displaced persons in the world and 28% of the world's refugees are actually from Africa. So it doesn't paint a very picture. This is from the experts meeting in Algeria. So while migration used to take place often between countries of colonial links, now it's all over, you know. Many of the Rwandans used to go and study in France and Belgium, but now they're all over. And maybe if our Vestine has a way, she may even be studying in Slovenia, who knows? Okay, so just to recap where we are. Now, my big issue. There are all these wonderful international instruments which most African countries have signed and ratified. So all 54, now we have South Sudan as a new country since July 2012, they've signed, and I don't think I need to maybe go into these international instruments, the Beijing Platform for Action, we've got the CEDAW, we've got the African Charter of Human and People's Rights, and then we have the Women's Protocol to the African Charter, of which I was privileged to work. And maybe just an aside, I was in Addis Ababa where we were making all these proposals, and it works the same way as the UN documents. We have things in brackets and you cross out what works and what worked. And then we had monogamy and polygamy is the preferred form of marriage. So even though many of us did not want to promote polygamy, we realized that the majority of women in the rural areas actually are sometimes in polygamous marriages. And how do we ensure that these instruments will improve the quality of their lives? And then there were 3 men from Rwanda, this was in 2003. And so we went to go lobby, you know, go to each, you know, the whole issue of lobbying, advocacy, go to different governments. What do you believe about this? So the Rwandan delegation, as I said, 3 men, said, no, we have no problem with polygamy. We're a Roman Catholic country and we only have monogamy. But of course, you know, I now live in Rwanda, and one of my students 2 years ago did a master's thesis on polygamous marriages and the advantages and disadvantages and, you know, women's lives. So yes, you know, sometimes our experts, you know, represent our country a little bit out of touch with what's going on. So yes, and then of course there are also, apart from the international instruments, there are continental instruments like the African Union, and I'll comment on that later. And then you also have regional, so you have ECOWAS, and you have the West Africa, and you have SADC in South Africa, also have very impressive. And the irony is that there's so much hype around this when you sign these, and you have on the television, the camera, you have these gala dinners. And after that, yeah, nothing, huh? They don't even, and one of the instruments, of course, is that many people don't know about is the Cotonou Agreement, where to try and promote and facilitate civil society to be involved in development. But I think I'm just going to skip that. I think I've got about 3 slides on this, but the aim is how do you, I think there must be a slide on aim, you know, restore peace and security, establish a new trade regime between the African, Caribbean and the Pacific countries and the European economic democracy. You are now part of the EU, improving the capacity, etc., all those wonderful things that they promote, especially civil society. And I think there's probably a slide how you, and this is from the Cotonou document from the EU, okay? So that's more of that. Really to, you know, because at the moment it seems like development aid is like government to government. And this project, I mean, the aim of the Cotonou Agreement is really to see how can civil society actively engage in change. Because that's ultimately where lots of change will come from. Okay, so there are more on that. And the task is not just about financing EC aid programs and projects. It's also concerned with important issues of creating citizenship, reducing poverty, etc., etc. So, and then they signed it in 2000. And okay, so now I want to talk about the African Union Protocol on Gender and Development. And I did a workshop on the, now I don't know if you know that we've got what's called the Pan-African Parliament, right? So representing all the African countries are in South Africa, in Johannesburg, where they have the Pan-African Parliament. And together, well, I think we're trying to do something like your Brussels thing, you know, with the European Union. So we're also trying to learn and to adjust and see how we can solve problems, and you know. And I did a workshop with the experts, with the advisors, and it was, for me, it was such an interesting thing where not a single advisor to the Pan-African government knew about the existence of this African Union Protocol on Gender Development. So you see, again, there's no synchronization. We have all these wonderful documents and no one knows about it. So anyway, so the aim of the AU Gender Protocol is to mainstream gender in all key issues. And again, I'm not going to outline too much. If anyone wants it, you can make available the PowerPoint, yeah? Okay, so there are 8 commitments, and one of the commitments is actually quite amazing, to re-dynamize the African women's movement. So I thought, oh, that's very radical, you know. And so I also want to ask, and hopefully in our discussions we can have, what is the state of women's movements in various African countries? I'm not quite sure if any of you know about the African Feminist Charter, but if you do have a chance, just go and look at on the internet. And we've got a charter that about, I think there were 40 countries, feminists from 40 countries actually came together and drew up this feminist charter, African Feminist Charter, okay? So, you know what, because they're always telling us, you know, the patriarchs in Africa, that feminism actually is a Western import, you know, but socialism isn't, you know, so it's very selective. But also when you look at our own histories and to see the amazing struggles of women hundreds of years ago, you know. There's a very interesting book by Kumari Jawardena. She's from Sri Lanka, and she wrote a Nationalism and Feminism in the Third World, and it was amazing the research she did. For example, the year 450 before Common Era, or BC as some people say before, the Vietnamese women were actually challenging, they wanted rights to land. So you see, we didn't hear feminism from the Western feminists. We just have our own struggles, eh? Just we don't know about it, okay? And yes, I'll share some positive examples of working together. How do we ensure that, you know, the member states, after they've signed, actually implement these treaties and conventions? And you know, there are a lot of clauses on culture, and I wonder how will you deal with it, you know, if it's contradictory to your culture or your religion. Okay, so commitment 1, creating an enabling and stable environment. And it's This as Africans, we always say this. We always pride ourselves. The AU parity principle represents the most advanced global commitment to equality representation between women and men in decision making. We pride ourselves with the most advanced. But that's where we stop. We don't actually implement. We don't disseminate. We don't share. We just make these wonderful commitments at these very high-profile meetings, at these very fancy hotels, and I was part of it, yeah. So, someone said to me once, I used to be a member of parliament in the first government of South Africa until 1999, and someone said, "Oh, how's parliament?" I said, "Oh, I'm so tired of crumbed prawns and champagne." After each budget vote, and I don't understand why, the old government, I wonder if your government does this, after each budget vote, you have a party. No, really. I mean, you know, I wonder if the Rwandans do that. It's interesting to know. Anyway, commitment 2, so we'll also have legislative protection, okay, against discrimination. So all our countries are working towards good laws. In other words, what we do, we are domestic. You probably know the term, you domesticate your laws to coincide with what CEDAW is saying, what Beijing is saying, so we're domesticating our laws. I'm a very patriotic African, so even though I'm critical, I'm not an Afrophobic person. I love Africa, but I think we need to have a critical consciousness around our Africa, okay? So yes, there are also contradictions, culture, human rights, women being stoned in Africa. And at that stage, when I said that, the delegate from Somalia walked out of the workshop, and I did that. Yeah, so these are all the commitment to legislate, okay? Commitment 3, mobilizing stakeholders for implementation. So it's actually a very well thought out document, very well thought out. And I'll just click through. 4, moving towards integration through harmonization with regional economic communities. So we have SADC in the south, we have ECOWAS, we have East Africa. So each section has all these regional economic communities that I'm just flitting through, okay? Then, not only do they want these new structures, they're also providing finance for that, which I think is wonderful. But the women's budget, the African Women's Trust Fund, I tried to find out whether it actually has been established. I haven't been able to, which probably means not yet, okay? Also capacity building, okay? And then gender mainstream. This is the buzzword, gender mainstream. We all want to gender mainstream, but sometimes we're not always quite sure what it means. And then, of course, peace building, promoting and having women-friendly and gender policies in times of conflict. And I'm sure you're very acquainted with that. So how do we implement Resolution 1325 and 1820 of the UN? And then, so I just thought I should put that picture there when you can look at the picture as opposed to me. But also, just while we're there, is that there's a big tension at the moment where some African states are believing that, you probably heard of the Great Lakes District, and the Great Lakes and all the tension that's there. And there's actually a very big lobby from African countries that we want to actually have more an African solution. Because we have UN peacekeepers there for 10 years at $100 million a year, dollars. And I'm not quite sure, to what extent they are actually achieving anything. So yes, the challenges continue, the luta continue, as we always say. So then also we've all signed the MDGs, and it's almost 2015. This will be a good benchmark to check whether we're actually promoting development in our countries. And again, we've all signed this. And in this report by the UNDP and the African Development Bank Group and the African Development and the Economic Commission, they had this report of 2010. And they claim that, it's actually not very, very, very successful, although there have been these major crises, food, financial uprisings, etc. and continued gendered poverty. And there's not been job creation. And you see that's another of the push factors. Not enough job. I mean, you find in many African countries, including my own, of young graduates not having a job, not having had a job for 10 years after graduation. So maybe there's something that we're not doing right. You know, what are we not doing right? Why are we not able to create jobs, enough jobs? There's youth unemployment in most of the countries, low productivity, poor governance. Well, I mean, poor governance, that for me is a big issue. And there's also concern because of the paucity of data. There's not a budget for data collection, so some of our things we do, we just speculate. We don't have enough information. When we do have enough, we're not disseminating it. Yeah? But anyway, according to this report by these eminent persons, that despite these very negative contexts, countries like Liberia and Sierra Leone have actually been able to improve to cut down on the infant mortality rate. But also Rwanda, and I wasn't quite sure how come they never mentioned Rwanda. Yeah? In fact, many reports actually say that Rwanda may be one of the only African countries to actually be able to implement most of the MDGs, if not all, most. Yeah? But you know, it depends on which report you're reading, what says what. Okay. So this report didn't say anything about Rwanda, so I was just wondering who was on the... Okay. I was going to say something which may be a little bit unprofessional, but I shall just smile and continue. So anyway, in this report it says, undoubtedly aid effectiveness requires close alignment of donor assistance with national priorities, including the MDGs. To this end, the implementation of the Paris Declaration and the Accra Agenda, which is all around development aid, to ensure a sharper focus by donors on the objectives of recipient countries towards poverty reduction and development. Now, I was part of when NEPAD was launched. You know, this new economic program for Africa. And the launch was in South Africa, in Durban, in 2003. And it was almost so contradictory because the whole issue around the NEPAD was developing Africa, to have African solutions for African problems. And yet the biggest clause was finance from the West. And I then represented the Commission on Gender Equality, and we were actually very critical of why are we so cash-strapped? What are we doing with our finances? And yes, we'll talk later about the fact that, you know, the price of coffee is determined in New York and London and Paris, and it's grown in Kenya and Rwanda and other African countries. So yes, there's something wrong with the economic program of the world. But yeah, but the fact that we are always wanting finance from the West. And there are lots of very controversial issues around finance, and including, I don't know if any of you have heard of reparations, that the countries must actually pay out Africa for slavery. Yeah? Very, very, very controversial. But we just clear now. We can talk about any questions, okay? So yes, there are all these obstacles to development in our country. We have the consequence of increased migration. You know, if you just can't get a job, you know, the increased religious fundamentalism. We have conflict and war at any one time. You know, we have unemployment. We have inability to absorb the skills. We have migration to other African countries, and also especially, I mean, there are 3 million Zimbabweans, registered Zimbabweans in South Africa. Now, if you think that Zimbabwe probably has about 11 or 14 million people, or 3 million in South Africa, and those are only documented, huh? We're not quite sure. And then, of course, to Europe and other developing countries, so the pull factors. And then, contributing, we have political unrest, we have political oppressions, we have instability, we have poverty. I mean, I think of two countries that are surrounded by South Africa, which I'm not sure if any of you have heard of, Lesotho and Swaziland. The entire revenue is like sometimes majority migrant labor from South Africa, from the mines. And then you think that, you know, this very country that has an Oxford-educated king who's like 40-something and has got 66 wives, you know, you think, yeah. And then you also have increased homophobia, right? That it's un-African. And what is interesting to learn, though, is whose agenda is it and where does the finance come from? And reliable resources shared how in Uganda, which actually had these anti-gay bills, was actually financed by groups from the United States. So, you know, colonialism, neo-colonialism, agendas continue being determined by other countries that have to have more money. So yes, the experts said that migration in and from Africa is also shaped by the complex social and political factors, the poor governance, and again we have to admit that there's poor governance, that there's patronage, there's corruption, and there's just human rights violations. I mean, I think of some of our most eminent African scholars are not in Africa. They're at Columbia University, Oxford, you know, because the atmosphere in their own countries are not really. I don't know if any of you have heard of Mahmoud Mandani, who's at Columbia, you know. In fact, he came to South Africa, and just a little aside, the white academics at the University of Cape Town just ousted him. So yes, South Africa is not always a very welcoming country for its academics. Huh? Okay, yeah. So now, just three examples. We have countries like Mauritania, where there's a big tension in terms of Sharia law, which I think you probably are very acquainted with as well. The increase of Sharia law and the whole issue around adultery and stoning by death, which actually does still take place. And Sharia law has become the basis for Mauritania's penal code in 1983, when these sets of laws were codified. However, although stoning is laid out in the law, there have been no reports of any stoning taking place. But we do know they take place in Mali, and we know that Mali is experiencing quite a challenging time in terms of a very fundamentalist group from the north. Nigeria, there are lots of tension in the south and the north, which coincides with Christian and Muslim. Sudan and Somalia. So this is one example that even if you're not Muslim, like in the south of Sudan, Amnesty International had this case of this woman, you know, who was actually stoned in southern Darfur. She was convicted of adultery and sentenced to death by stoning by a local court in Nyala city. But remember, even though there is very adverse things happening, women's movements are really quite active. I was sharing yesterday with Maya and others about Women Living Under Muslim Law, which is an organization in about 70 or 80 Muslim countries, and the work they're doing and the research they're doing, including having Islamic feminist theologians and analyzing, you know, what is being said in the Quran, what is being said in different Sharias, etc. So the agency of religious women actually is challenging the sort of the gospel according to some Sharia laws. In fact, in 1980, when I was doing my master's I was fortunate to be in the Netherlands with a very international group of women, and one of my friends entered female circumcision the first time. We were doing research on it. African women doing research on genital mutilation. And when she went back to the whole of East Africa, to Sudan, and to Somalia, she was told, no, the Quran says this. It's in the Quran. And then she went to West Africa. No, it's in the Bible. And of course, and then you actually analyze. It's not there, you know. But these are customs. But because women were not actually reading before, we were not educated before, they weren't able to counter these gospels according to some patriarchs, you know. And yes, and feminist theologians of different religions are actually actively studying the various religious texts, because that's one of the key ways in which to oppress women. So that was an example in South Sudan, and this is the case of, even though this woman Abouk was a member of the largest ethnic group in southern Sudan, the Dinka, whose religious beliefs are Christian or even animist, and who speaks Dinka and English. She, as a non-Muslim, was actually sentenced in a court that was in Arabic, you know. So much for justice. South Africa. Now we're going to do a little bit about my own country. I'm not going to be very, very long. How much time do I have left? 50 minutes. Well, I'm going to skim through this, okay? We can do the issues around question back. We've had a very long protracted political struggle, about 400 years. Now, I have not been around, but I have been around the past 45 years. Very, very marginalized, rich, poor, white, black. And I think what for me is almost the key issue, and it's 100 years anniversary this year, 1913, with the Native Land Act, where 87% of the land was taken as white land, as white South Africa, and 13% black South Africans. Now, can you imagine? You have a settler community coming in, minority, and what is very interesting, the way they've carved up the South Africa is they've carved it up according to where the minerals are, right? So you'd have one country, black country, called Bafutatswana, consisting of 13 bits of land. So you have Bafutatswana, and you have a gold mine, so you have white South Africa, and then you have Bafutatswana, and then you have a diamond one that's, you know, 13 bits, so I mean, it's just a crazy system. Anyway, so that was the way, you know, black Africans had to be working in mines. They came from a very subsistence economy, and they were forced to go into the mines because they then charged a hut tax, which means it was money economy, so that was a very forced way of it. Anyway, so we had a very long struggle, and one of the key things that actually still is a major problem, despite our new South Africa and our wonderful constitutions and our wonderful gender-sensitive national machinery, is the fact that violence against women is actually so rife. We don't have up the minute a very detailed research, and I'm challenging, why don't we do some more research, that every 6 minutes a woman is killed by an intimate partner. So it's not the dark stranger that mothers sometimes accuse us of, don't walk in the dark, it's actually in the home. And this for me is the key issue around patriarchy, culture and violence, is that the sanctity, the home, which is supposed to be the sanctity. And we had a wonderful workshop 2 weeks ago by Rwandan Men's Network, RWAMNEC. And they did research in most of Rwanda with 7 other organizations, and again, the same thing, violence was most prevalent in the home. Okay, so let us just get away from the dark stranger in the dark corner. You know, it's that, and that's the issue around patriarchy. The fact that men own their families, incest, violence, etc. So here's there's like a joke, oh, Cape Town is the rape capital of the world, Rape Town, Cape Town. Very beautiful city, yes, but problems. But of course it doesn't go unnoticed, lots of protests all the time. And of course we had the African, the African Federation Cup now, and of course this is what the women did. 84th in soccer, but first in rape. Huh? So it's we have a very dynamic civil society movement in our country, okay? It doesn't matter which race or class, locality you live in, South African women are vulnerable. And we often say, if the number of injured of women had been not gendered as aggregated, South Africa would have declared a civil war because of the number of injuries and deaths. I'm sitting through. I emphasize the fact that it doesn't matter which class you are. This is, you know, there were 2 very high-profile cases of violence against women murdered. This was the 2nd of February. A rural 70-year-old young woman who was raped, who was gang raped, left for dead, and for some reason, I think what the sad thing about my country is that not only is there violence against women, but the degree of violence, like slitting up from the top of the throat down and taking the guts out. I mean, why, you know? So this is rural, young, uneducated black And then I'm just going to flip through the next few slides. And this is 2nd of February. And yeah, so we had lots of protests again. And the issue around violence. So yes, she was slit open and she was still alive when she was found. Anyway, so a white model, Reva Steenkamp, who happens to be, now I'm not quite sure, you know, in Australia, which is a sports-mad country, they know everything about South African athletes. So maybe you don't know about our South African athlete called Oscar Pistorius, who's a Blade Runner. But anyway, so his girlfriend was also shot, and this is what she wrote just a few days before about Anin. I woke up in a happy, safe home this morning. Not everyone did. Speak out against rape of individuals in South Africa. Rest in peace, Anin voice. And this is the young woman that was. And then, of course, a few days later, on Valentine's morning, she was killed. Well, we let the court do its work. This famous athlete claimed that he thought it was a burglar. What is interesting is my friends right from South Africa, the way the media has played this up now, that this blonde model is now the bad girl, and this hero, white male hero, Paralympic is now the hero, and you know, and apparently this is how the media's playing it up. And yes, the media is really promoting and reinforcing patriarchy. Of course, in South Africa, you know, they have all these cartoons, so that's the wonderful thing about this country. You can poke fun at everyone. So that is, yeah, and okay, so I'm just going to flip through this. And, but you know, South Africans are really amusing. This is a very nice way of having a queue, isn't it? So I thought, you know, I mean, apart from the fact that violence against women, you know, it's such a funny society. You can just enjoy yourself and laugh and have fun. And I mean, no way, you know, will this happen, you know, put your foot shoes down. You know? So that's my country. Okay, so yes, we have a rape crisis. We don't have funds for these organizations. And the leader of the rape crisis says we've never had a leader in government who feels strong enough to take this matter forward. And the sad thing is that even we have the opposition, which is supposed to be, you know, for organizations and for people, they've also cut down the funding. So yes, women's organizations are having a very, very challenging time in South Africa. But if we've got to just, I promise you, if there's going to be another sports event, you know, when India couldn't have a sports, we took over the cricket. You know, when Libya couldn't take, we took over the soccer. Huh? That's what we can do. All the families. But violence against women. Okay, and now about Rwanda, the country in which I now live. As academics, one of the key things that we find almost, you know, almost, if it were not so tragic, it would be funny, how the media and the refereed and peer-reviewed journals depict Rwanda. And when you look at the bibliography, you notice, first of all, that, I mean, I think of a journal by Fletcher School for Justice. And when I mentioned this to the Fulbright student who lives at my house, she says, oh, that's a very prestigious law school. And I said, oh, really? But they publish articles that actually has no empirical data, you know. And you'll find that these very articles are just quoting pale male North Americans. And people don't actually know what's going on in Rwanda, and they churn out these journals, you know, about how terrible things are in Rwanda. I mean, I think of René Lemarchais, who says how wonderful things are in Rwanda. I mean, in Burundi, and how in Congo, well, comme ça. But Rwanda is the worst. So it's like authors are just polarized. And we've had a UN group of experts who are totally anti-Rwanda. Now we've got a new group of experts. And again, this one, Laloup, Belgian Laloup, everything he's published in the past 20 years just says how bad everything is in Rwanda. And he happens to have been the advisor to the former president of Rwanda, the one, Habyarimana, who was killed in the plane crash. So, yeah. But I think there's some very wonderful things. As much as the media in the West will say how Kagame is going to change the constitution, there have been active talks in the country about the succession debate. In fact, I was sharing how in 2011 he was saying, oh, he'd love a woman to take over, but of course the party will decide. I think that my experience in terms of International Women's Day, I've been part of meetings there where we have the National Women's Council planning the International Women's Day. It's a whole month, from the 8th of March to the 5th of April. And each week is a different theme: education, health, economic empowerment, and justice. And the way they're engaging with government, I mean, I just think it's interesting. And then the first theme, now the international theme is gender on the agenda, right? Remember all the countries, I don't know if you people are involved in International Women's Day, but anyway, so the international theme is gender on the agenda. And then Rwanda's theme was that the Women's National Council had was what does gender equality mean for the family? And then it went to Cabinet, and Cabinet sent it back and said, shouldn't we have gender equality in the family, promoting dignity? And it's just so amazing, the whole issue around dignity in the family, you know. The Akachiro Fund. Rwanda is also quite remarkable in terms of African countries. Many African countries are really like wanting to have all this development aid all the time, and you know, sort of sometimes even servile and sycophantic. And I remember at an international conference about 3 years ago in Rwanda, there was a international hygiene and nutrition conference, and Gami spoke and he said, but we don't need development aid to be clean, we can just wash our hands ourselves. And you should have seen how the other African leaders of the countries looked at him, you know, could have said that, you know. So he's really very brave. And about 4 or 5 years ago, they started this Akachiro Fund, which is a development fund where people voluntarily donate to the government towards development projects. But it's also a means to lessen their dependency on external funding. But of course, you know, the group of experts, such experts who claim that Rwanda was involved in the civil war and rebellion in the east of Congo, their report said that without any proof. They've also leaked without Rwanda. You know, usually at the UN, when there's a country report, you're allowed to give a chance to respond. Nothing in the case of Rwanda, right? So now the world, the Western world says Rwanda is involved in a war in Congo. And so this is expedited the Agachiro Fund. So all of us had to then have consultative meetings to discuss how much we're giving to development aid. And my university decided 30%. So every month, 30% of our salaries for the next year will go to development projects. And you could sometimes choose which development projects. Some other people have chosen 10%. Well, the Public Servants League chose 10%. They heard me say 30%. Well, they were quite embarrassed. But anyway, so we give 30% of our salary. There have been 1 or 2 cases, and I must emphasize, where teachers at a school had the principal sign on their behalf to give this 10%. And when people complained, the government immediately negated and cancelled those, you sign a debit order, and said, no, people who give money to Akachiro Fund must do so willingly. So they refused that. Now other teachers are, paying. So it's really remarkable to see how the poorest of the poor in rural areas are all. I think this word is called Intora, promoting dignity and patriotism. I think I need to end now. Okay. And then also just in terms of reconciliation in South Africa, I think that must I stop? Can I stop in 2 minutes, in 4 minutes time?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. And then maybe you also heard of Maganda, when the last Saturday of the month everybody cleans up. From 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. you clean up, and then from 9 a.m. to 11 you have political education. And of course the critiques of this Umaganda says, oh no, it's the government indoctrinating. But what is interesting is that these people at the cell level will actually discuss new bills, so it's actively engaged in policies. And then the wonderful thing, I want to compare South Africa and Rwanda, is that we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission which was temporary. But I must say that we have not solved our reconciliation issues. We have not discussed racism enough in South Africa. We have not actually discussed reparations and forgiveness. I'm one of 17,000 who, because of my imprisonment and my torture, receive a fund at the end of the month, every month. But the majority of people don't receive that. So that project is inconclusive in South Africa. Rwanda, on the other hand, has a permanent commission on fighting genocide. They have a permanent commission on National Commission for Unity and Reconciliation. So I think that Rwanda really can show us South Africans something around reconciliation. But South Africans are always, the entrepreneurs. They now are exporting TRCs all over the world and the consultants to all the African countries and other countries. But we forget to work at home. Charity begins at home. So yeah, we have some work to do. So yes, they're now having, we haven't finished the NDGs yet, but they're having the post-global development agenda, which Gracia Machel, whom some of you may know, happens to be the wife of our first president, Nelson Mandela, and they're talking about how to give advice to the UN in terms of post-20. And I want to conclude with one of my favorite people in the world. That I'm an activist and I'm an academic and I'm a feminist because I believe that I cannot be free. Of course, I'm not in prison any longer. Of course, I can do mostly what I want to if I have the facilities and the resources. But we cannot be free at an individual level. So I can't be free merely by casting off my chains as a black woman. I'm actually the first person in my family to have tertiary education and first generation urban. But we have to live in such a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. And I think that's where I'd like to end. And I just have some questions. What should change? Who decides on prices? Is a problem having dictators and despots as rulers on our continent? Options for development, etc. And then, just as a feminist, I have to add this. Mohanty talks about the feminist careers who go from country to country, and my friend Patricia McFadden talks about gender divas. So yes, I am a gender diva, but I think I'm accountable to poor women, and I think as long as I have the energy, that's my commitment. Thanks very much. So we now have 5 minutes break.
We still have 10 minutes for questions left.
I'm going to put some questions on.
Yeah, can you answer the third?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite questions. As someone who was in Parliament, we had our party, well, we had a big fight to do it, of course. We wanted 50%. We had negotiations for a long time, from 1990 to 1993. And we wanted 50% the African National Congress. And we had 7 hours of debate, and they wouldn't give in. And then the proposal was from Nelson Mandela, can we have a little committee to do that? So then they decided on 33%. So yes, just like Rwanda, South Africa was this country that suddenly had all these women in government. But the point is, the tension is, whose agenda are we able to promote in government? So yes, first of all, are numbers enough? We can have 56% in your government, but if you don't have a group of women committed to women's issues, like reproductive rights, control of their own body, it doesn't make any matter. And we also had, I tease and say, Margaret Thatcher was a prime minister, but they called her Margaret Thatcher milk snatcher, because she was the first one to stop the school feeding scheme in Britain, and we had other examples like I hold in my hair. So firstly, I think we're talking about the quality of people. Anne-Marie Goods and Shireen Hassim, 2004, speak about descriptive representation or strategic representation. Are you able to distinguish and to promote an agenda? If you can, then it's important. But if not, numbers are not enough. So we're talking about not the quantity of numbers, but rather the quality and what women can bring in. I think there's also a big tension around the agendas, you know, how the party enforces the agenda on you, you know, and how much room. I must say that I still have 4 very close girlfriends who are still in government, and every time I listen to their stories, I just say, thank God I took the decision to leave. It is a total nightmare. Other women again have, I mean, one just anecdotal. When we first had the new government, we had these people who've never ever done, we've never been in government before, right? So now we're in government and we had strategic teams to meet any minister. And at a cocktail, I said to one of the ministers of correctional services, oh, I noticed that you only have men on your strategic management team. And apparently the next day my name came up for what we call political deployment. I don't know where I was there, you know, they pushed the particular place. And he said, oh no, Gertrude is not loyal enough. So many of us have left politics because we're not pushing the party agenda, you know. So yes, I think that it's wonderful when you must have a strategic number, you must have a mass, critical mass to be able to promote your agenda. But unless this critical mass is committed and has links with the feminist movement, women's movements outside, and take direction, and we have this conversation, it's actually just going to create what Mohanty calls these feminist careers. Huh? I mean, you have, what does it mean when in my country you have women, you know, driving the best cars in the world as women ministers, and you still have the extreme poverty. South Africa now, as you know, we're always #1 for things. We've taken over now. Brazil used to be #1 in terms of the Gini coefficient, the gap between rich and poor. South Africa is now #1. So yes, we have a number of women in government and a number of committed women, but are we able to change the priorities, the budget votes? Do we have that power, and how do we? Of course, what we did is we actually engaged with very important men too, in terms of the constitution. I was part of the constitutional, I was part of the lobbying group. Huh? So you also engage with some men in terms of getting certain issues, you know. So it's not just a woman's only thing. You get men who are there to be our allies, and we've had them, you know, some wonderful men who helped us with our constitution and pushed and helped promote our agenda. But no, it's not enough to just have numbers. It's helpful, but you must have a critical mass of women, and you must have women committed to change issues. Ana Balletbo from Spain, there's a book out by IDEA that talks about, and in fact the title is Are Numbers Enough, if those of you know it, and she says, it's a double-edged sword, I probably have a quotation somewhere on my there, that men get women into government who can promote their agenda and who will actually promote their hegemony. So I'm saying with deep respect that there are very many women in many countries who are actually committed. And one of my students now that I was a master's, I was a supervisor, she's now the minister, the new minister of gender and family promotion in Rwanda since Monday. So I'm very proud of her. And I hope that the things I said will really stay there. So yes, and I have great respect for many of these women. And they have a tireless job. And by the way, just to say that Oda did her research on women leaders and traditional family roles. And of course, you know, she interviewed all these women ministers and how they worked in parliament all these hours and came home and did all this, you know. So yes, the public sphere has changed in terms of women being the engineers, women being the minister of parliament, women being the prime minister. But the private has not changed. So you come home and you still have to do all that work, you know. It hasn't changed. And even my beloved Rwanda, as Oda's research shows, that it hasn't changed, you know. These women really have a triple duty as members of parliament, as ministers, as mothers, as community workers. So la lucha continua. But it doesn't mean we mustn't do it, we must still fight on, you know. Yeah.
But when you talk about gender equality, can you, I don't know, make a difference between position of women who live in rural areas? Usually we're talking also about polygamy in some countries, African countries, we see that this is the practice mostly we see in rural areas, not in the cities so much.
Is that comment
and
on
the
that?
position of women in these urban areas.
Yeah.
Is there a difference?
Well, firstly, I mean, there's a major difference, and I actually facetiously refer to these fancy cars that women are driving. We have, not only do we have the fact that they are in government and they are decision makers, their material reality has changed. And unfortunately, in many rural areas, women's lives have not changed. Women's lives are actually even worse. And when I was engaging in some of the women's groups, you know, in South Africa, and they were complaining, I said, oh, but you must go to your member of parliament, you know, and I referred to the woman's name, and they said, oh no, she just drives fast past us with a big car. And I just thought, that's what's happening, you know. And just to give one example also, I mean, I stand here really privileged because of my students that have done amazing research in Rwanda and rural areas. One of my students, Mario Detkansanga, did research on Tutsi women who were raped and impregnated during the genocide. And she outlines the complexities of these women's lives. For some reason, I don't know why, they don't get the one cow per family. These women are already ostracized. This is a poverty reduction strategy where each poor family will get a cow. These women don't get cows. Why not, you know? And how they're stigmatized by the society, you know, because of these illegitimate children. And one of the words that I found was with some of the interviews, like the one woman said, I first hated this child, but then I decided that I will defy society and I will love this child, and it's my child. And these women, under these very amazing circumstances, are giving these children wonderful lives amidst the poverty, you know. So yes, the poverty is still very ripe, but I hope that later on, when Vestine speaks, she could give some other perspectives. But these are my perspectives, and I say limited as an outsider, and also being informed by my students' research. So I don't pretend to be an expert. I know that I'm an eternal scholar, and I learn every day, you know. And I stand open to correction. But, and then the other thing about the rural area, so of course we go to Agashura, which is in the west of the country, yeah? So in the car. And my friend who's lived in Rwanda for many years tells me about this. I said, oh, well the good thing is that there's a tap like every 10 kilometers, so it's not too bad. But it's only women with those big yellow bottles, you know, getting the water. And then I saw a man with a big yellow bottles on a bicycle. I said, oh, there's a man who's getting water. She said, no, that's banana wine. So the women get the water and the men get the banana wine. So you see what I mean? So gender equality, and of course, you know, the issue is also the whole thing of conflating gender with issues around women, is how do you incorporate men into this, because you cannot change the situation without engaging men's roles, because they too are oppressed, and often they don't even know that, some of them don't know that, but they also are oppressed. And that is why the Rwandan Men's Network, they're doing such incredible work. But you know what they share with us? Well, three of the founding members have been students of ours. But before, I mean, they started, I mean, we came on afterwards. So they, you know, a pioneer started the Rwandan Men's Network. And they were saying how other men see them as traitors, because they are working for gender equality. So yes, you know, we may have in South Africa a high number of women in government, and we may in Rwanda have the highest number of women in parliament, but the challenges continue, so yeah. So that's question 3. I hope I've not disappointed you or made you hopeless, but I mean, you know, work to be done. Say too, you know. I'm not sure about your country, how many women are here in decision making?
I just wanted to make a comment on that, if I can. I come from a rural area in Slovenia, and I think all of us that come from rural areas can say that gender roles are very much present. I mean, Slovenia is, in this sense, quite similar, actually. And I just wanted to say, I remember one sentence from one of your interviews where you said that gender equality starts in bedroom.
Yeah, I always use it. As a gender commissioner, I had to go to all these ministries, right? And I'd say specifically, how do we translate the decisions we take in the boardroom into the bedroom? And because that's where it starts. Who takes decisions? Who initiates what? You know? And they feel very uncomfortable. That's what it is, you know. Gender equality is a very personal issue around my life. And how do I... But the thing is about rural Slovenia, I mean, the only international non-racist, non-sexist, non-classist, non-anything is patriarchy. You know? So it's all over, you know. It's just sometimes more blatant in some of the African countries in terms of you must wear a veil, you must do this, or you must have be circumcised or mutilated, etc. But the subtleties are there, you know. Women in universities in England, for example, that I'm acquainted with, say how they can't get a tenure. They're women, you know. And so there are different levels of women's oppression. That's it. Hope I haven't